Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, sponsored by the National Health Association. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and I'm delighted today to have my special guest, an old friend, Dr. Dina. Rick has a long professional life in the field of plant-exclusive nutrition. He's the founder, along with his wife, of an online program called Mastering Raw Food Nutrition Educator Course. And I'm just so delighted to have you. Welcome. Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association, the oldest organization in the world championing the extraordinary benefits of a whole plant food diet and healthy lifestyle, as well as water-only fasting. We believe that health results from healthful living and focus on evidence-based science that promotes the health of you and your loved ones, as well as the health of all animals and the environment. We feature experts from a cross-section of disciplines within the plant nutrition, vegan, psychological, environmental, and animal compassion sectors. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, the NHA's Director of Health Education.
Dr. Sabatino, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. You're one of my earliest mentors, so it really is it's an honor to be interviewed by you and to be here.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to start off, Rick. I know you have a history going back to almost the mid-1980s, really being involved in, plant-exclusive nutrition and the like. Take us back to some of the early history and, the motivations and the ways that you circled into this way of thinking and living.
Sure. Well, I grew up eating pretty conventionally, and it ended up causing me a lot of hay fever issues. Starting when I was about 7 or 8 years old, I developed hay fever. So in the spring, all the pollen would be around and everything, and I would get congested. I'd have watery eyes. I'd blow my nose a million times a day, and it was really an issue. I missed school sometimes because of it, and I was also, as high school went on, I started to gain some weight and didn't feel good. I was just feeling real sluggish and was interested in making some changes. So when I started changing my diet, I started noticing, wow, I really feel better. And then the crux to that, to finish the allergy part of it, is when I was a junior in college, I water fasted for 14 days, not the way I recommend doing it, but I was young and enthused, a little bit reckless. I had Herbert Shelton's book, Fasting Can Save Your Life, there to guide me. And when spring came along, that was in the winter, spring came along that year, I didn't have allergy symptoms. I was just astounded and absolutely amazed that occurred. And I had been reading about these things for a few years at that point, but that just so solidified how incredible our body's healing capabilities are if we give them the opportunity.
And that was just basically jumping into like fruits and vegetables at that time, because your knowledge base wasn't certainly what it is now. So you just kind of started with that.
Yeah, I started actually, my younger brother was into sports nutrition type of stuff to increase his track performance in high school. So I started with some basic sports nutrition that was talking about less fat, more complex carbohydrates. So I'd take the skin off my chicken before I cooked it and put a paper towel on it to soak up some of the grease, or ordered a pizza with half the amount of cheese and put a paper towel on that to soak up some grease also. And then started adding whole wheat pasta instead of white pasta, whole grain bread instead of white bread, brown rice instead of white. And just by making those basic changes, I slimmed down 15 pounds over one summer, and then just wanted to keep learning more. And then came across Fit for Life, the American Natural Hygiene Society, books by Dr. McDougall, et cetera, and started including more fruits and vegetables, and just started feeling better and better.
It's interesting when you talked about fasting with Shelton's books by your side, you're actually in good company, because people don't know this, and I've heard tell, and I haven't been able to completely check it out, but one of the people that used fasting as one of the greatest political tools did it with the same books by his bedside, Mahatma Gandhi.
Yeah,
supposedly
absolutely.
He had Shelton's books by his side. So while the whole world thought he was dying, he knew he wasn't, and he used that very astutely as a political tool to change the world, really, to change the entire British domination of India, which is really kind of pretty amazing when when you think about that.
Pretty
You know what I mean?
profound. Well, didn't he actually, I mean, I'm sure you know the history more than I do, but didn't he actually know Dr. Shelton personally some?
That's what I'm not sure of. I know
Okay.
that he definitely was a student of his writing and his books, but I don't know about their personal communication as much. There's some suggestion that they did communicate and they did have contact, but I can't say that for sure. You know what I mean? I noticed early on in those days that from that point, you ended up spending some time with two interesting places. One was with Hippocrates, which we'll talk a little bit about,
Yeah.
and with the Juice Man. Tell me about those experiences and
Oh my
how
gosh.
that came to pass.
Wow. Okay. Wow. Okay. So for Hippocrates, so let me see. So I started making major changes to my diet in 1986. By 1987, that spring, I went heavily raw into the kind of more of the natural hygiene approach.
Right.
That fast I mentioned in college was 1988. So then in early 1991, I was done with college. I was a business major, but I was really into health. Getting more into a raw food diet. So in 1991, I moved down to Florida, not far from you, as you know, and spent 6 months at Hippocrates Health Institute, where they advocate a diet of vegetables and sprouts and juices and dehydrated foods, not that much fruit. And, I liked the food a lot. I saw a lot of interesting things, met some people who recovered from serious diseases. And that was really cool. Although one thing that happened was there was some guests would come regularly. And there was one guest that was there at the beginning during the time I was there. And then she came back 4 or 5 months later. And she said to me, "Oh, look at you. Remember I was here when you just started and you're all nice and tan now." And I was like, okay, that makes sense. I lived in Florida instead of Connecticut. And she's like, "And you've really filled out." And she was being complimentary because I looked heavier and I thought, oh my gosh, yeah, I guess I have gained some weight. And eating a higher fat raw diet caused me to gain weight. Every night there's either avocado night or nut loaf night. And I enjoyed eating that stuff, but I didn't feel as good and I gained some weight compared to eating more fruit. So that was one thing that came out of that. But a lot of aspects were good. So
And I know their complaint is a lot about the hybridization of fruit, but I think people lose sight of the fact that that's probably about the most natural food for human primates. And I mean, if you look at the volume of fruit that I eat on a daily basis and the amount of vitamin content that really exists in the diversity of fruit, I still feel that that's a huge mistake not to advocate a significant amount of fruit in the diet. I mean, that's just my opinion in looking at it. And also all the years of myself eating it, it's made such a difference in the quality of my life and health and energy. So that's one of the places where, I would deviate in discussions, even with Brian. I know the owner, very long time and the people
yeah,
there. So
same.
they do some good work. There's people that have fared very well there, but I believe that that's really a shortcoming, truthfully, to not advocate good quality, organic, fresh fruit. What do you feel about that?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And it was funny. I'd go home at night and make banana ice cream and eat
Yeah,
fruit. But it was nice being there during the day. I was drinking
right.
the juices that were great and enjoying the sauerkraut and other stuff. But I fully agree with what you just said, Dr. Sabatino, about fruit. The point of hybridization, and a lot of people make that point. The fruit these days is sweeter. It's
Right.
not as high in fiber. It's not really as rich in minerals. So, and this kind of brings up another topic of fruitarianism. A lot of the people say we're
Right.
designed to eat fruit and all that, but then they don't eat vegetables, and then they miss out on key minerals. And you've probably seen this over time. The teeth and gum problems come in. The cognitive function tends to they can't focus really well. And considering all that, I'd say, look, if you want to recreate the ideal fruitarian diet of, maybe it's hypothetical a bit in the past, what you really need to do today is take the fruit that has been hybridized, because that's what's available to us, and combine it with a lot of vegetables to
Right.
fill in the greater fiber, the greater mineral content, make sure your essential fats are there. And lots of vegetables, along with plenty of fruit in the diet, as the foundation, really seems to be a winning combination.
Yeah, I think the copious use, especially of just greens. I mean, when you think about it, how valuable those plants are in the overall eating plan. And if you look at the professors of human primates, bonobos and gorillas and so on, I mean, those brilliant primate doctors, they load up on those particular foods in addition to the fruits that they eat. So if they go through a banana tree, they'll eat the banana and all the leaves on the tree. I mean, so, they'll go through all of that. And I think that leads to a kind of a different mindset for how we need to kind of look at that. And I agree with you, with people that have just gone fruitarian without really incorporating some of those vegetables and plants I think do have deficits that can be quite problematic, actually. I'm here with Dr. Rick Dina. We're going to actually take just a few minutes to hear from our sponsor, the National Health Association, and we'll be right back. You're listening to the Health Science Podcast Show. I want to remind you to visit the National Health Association website, where you'll find incredible resources to support your healthy lifestyle, including plant-exclusive eating without added salt, oil, and sugar. Simply go to healthscience.org or nationalhealthassociation.org. Be sure to check out membership, which is only $35 per year for those living within the United States and $55 for those living outside the U.S. You'll be amazed at all the information and benefits you'll receive. As a member, you're kept up to date on the latest evidence-based tools for health promotion. You'll receive the incomparable quarterly magazine, Health Science, a beautiful 40-page advertising-free publication mailed to your home or offices, loaded with articles, recipes, inspirational stories, and interviews with world leaders in the fields of personal health, plant-based nutrition, water-only fasting, animal rights, and environmental support. And you'll receive details about life-changing events, such as the extraordinary annual conference of the National Health Association and diverse opportunities for plant-exclusive NHA cruises and travel vacations to exotic destinations around the globe. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and now back to the show. Welcome back to the Health Science Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and I'm here with Dr. Rick Dina. And Rick has been an advocate for many years of whole, raw plant food nutrition. So let's talk a little bit about that, because as you know, as this has evolved, there's controversies that come up. You brought up a good one, meaning that many times my experience with raw food diets completely, and I've done them at different times of my life for certain periods, they tend to be very loaded with oils and fats, because it becomes a lot of nut loaves and a lot of these kinds of foods where, we're advocating an eating plan that's about 15% fat, and this can bring it up to like 40 to 50% fat. And there are problems that can occur from that kind of fat consumption. So let's talk about how you, in your mind, fashion the idea of raw food, how you envision that in the best way possible from your standpoint, from your perspective.
Sure. So as you mentioned, and we talked about the Hippocrates type of diet, when you're trying to eat your food uncooked and you're avoiding fruit, vegetables are super low in calorie density, and so are green sprouts. I mean, at what is lettuce, 70 calories per pound.
Right.
Maybe you get a little over 100 for some of the more concentrated vegetables, but you can't eat enough. We don't have the capacity to eat 20 pounds of vegetables and green sprouts a day to get enough calories. So if you're avoiding fruit and then you're not eating starches like potatoes and other things at 400, 500, 600 calories per pound, well, then what's left? Nuts and seeds and avocados and oils.
Right.
So these low fruit or gourmet, sometimes fits into there as well, type of raw food diets do end up being very high in fat. And, I think it's a mistake. I mentioned the story. The lady said, I filled out, I gained weight doing that. Whereas you can include fruit as a very good calorie source. Bananas are similar to starches at 400 calories per pound. Other fruits on average are a little bit lower. So make sure you eat enough fruit, I would say, especially if you want to be mostly raw, because that's where the majority of your calories are going to come from. And make sure you eat plenty of leafy greens and vegetables to fill in the nutritional gaps where fruit misses a little bit. And that combination is a good foundation. You still need a few more calories. A little bit of extra healthy fat, I think, is reasonable. I eat about 20% of my calories from fat. That seems to work out pretty well. Or I'm certainly by no means against people adding some quinoa and brown rice and chickpeas and other healthy starches to make sure they're getting enough calories also.
Yeah, let's go a little further. As you know, many of the plant-based docs, whether it's the John McDougals of the world or me or any number of people, while you're advocating a diet that still is probably 90% raw, I mean, pretty much, they still will advocate the use of cooked starches. So let's talk about that just a little bit, because I find in my own life, when I've done all raw and I can do it, there's something satisfying about having a baked or steamed sweet potato or having something like that within the context of all these raw veggies and greens. So because you advocate this raw approach so much, give us your viewpoint of why you feel that that's not an ideal thing to do if that's what you actually believe.
Oh, that being raw is not ideal, or even
No, that
starches
having
is
some
not
cooked
ideal?
starches is not ideal. Let's talk about that.
Sure. So in my personal experience, since about 1987, I've been about 90% of my calories have come from raw food, and 10% have been a few times a week, some potatoes, steamed vegetables, those things. So I'm not against those
Oh, so
things.
you still incorporate those to some degree in your diet?
To some degree. Now, you mentioned Dr. Sabatino. You've gone through periods of being raw in your life. So I happen to be in one of those periods in my life right now. For the last 3.5 years, I've been,
Right.
just raw. And what I notice is that, let's say in my particular case, 90% raw versus 100% raw. Um, I notice kind of like I feel really good at 90% raw, but with
Right.
100%, I notice I get a little bit of extra credit in how I feel. I'm just a little more clear,
Right.
a little more grounded feeling, a little bit more energetic, a little bit better mental clarity. I just kind of feel a little bit lighter, and I like that. Now, this is the longest I've gone, even though it's been 35 years or so eating mostly raw. This is the longest period I've gone completely raw. I keep telling myself it's going to be so interesting to see what happens when I put some steamed vegetables or some potatoes and other things back into my diet. But I'm a big fan of everybody finding what works best for them. And
Is that how you let's go there. Is that how you counsel people you work with? Do you assess what they're capable of really achieving and handling in that moment, and then try to structure your counseling around where they are in their own evolution? Is that something that you think about as you counsel people?
Absolutely. Dr. Karen and I, my wife and I, we always kind of our basic rubric there is meet people where they are and encourage them to then take whatever the next logical step for them is, depending on all circumstances in their life, including their motivation level.
Right.
And we're not going to make anyone wrong for not, like if you go out and you run a few miles a week and you weren't before, that's fantastic. We're not going to make anyone wrong because they're not training for the Olympics. We're going to tell them they're doing a great job.
I'm here with Dr. Rick Dina, and who's been an advocate of whole food, raw nutrition for plant food nutrition for a very long time, practices it in his life, but has been involved in the plant food movement for a long time. Rick, let people know where they can find you online. What's the best place to find you?
Sure. It's our website, rawfoodeducation.com. I can see it scrolling by there now.
Yep.
And just want to let everyone know, to not scare them away, our approach to eating is whole food, plant-based, with an emphasis on fresh fruits and vegetables.
I got it. That's great.
So it's not just raw food. And in fact, we have a whole course called Mastering Raw Food Nutrition.
Yeah, and I want to get into that. I want to ask you something before. I want to ask you something before that.
Sure.
If you look at a lot of data, a lot of epidemiological data, and so on, there are foods that, in a sense, make nutrients more available in a cooked state and actually prevent certain irritation in a cooked state. For example, we can take things like beans or even some of the harder cruciferous veggies, which right out of the blocks is not something we would eat really in a raw state. So how do you reckon with those foods? Do you just feel that because they can't be eaten raw, they're really not an ideal part of the human diet? Or do you think that they're better in a sprouted form? Or how would you look at the idea of beans with lectins, for example? Because there's a lot of anti-cancer properties in things like beans and even lectins in beans, but you can deactivate the inflammatory, irritating nature of them by cooking them for a certain period of time. So how do you reckon with that idea?
Sure. First of all, not against cooked beans. If someone's eating all cooked beans and they never eat fruits and vegetables, I think they can add some fruits and veggies to their diet to be a bit healthier. If they're eating a lot of fruits and vegetables and including beans along with some other starches maybe to make sure they're getting enough calories, I'm definitely not against that. But to answer your question more directly, there are certain beans that you need to cook in order to make them healthy. So kidney beans, for example, are very, very unhealthy if you don't cook them. So sprouted kidney beans contain some substances called hemagglutinins that clump your red blood cells together and cause all sorts of problems. Some types of beans, when they're raw and sprouted, contain trypsin and chymotrypsin inhibitors, and that can cause a lot of digestive issues. So for example, with chickpeas, I love raw sprouted chickpeas. And when I eat some of those, I enjoy them and I feel good. But if I eat a lot of them, I start to get a lot of indigestion and a lot of gas pains. In fact, I'm thinking back to when I was in chiropractic college, I would sometimes make raw hummus patties. So I would sprout chickpeas and I would mix them with some onion and celery and carrot and form them into a mush and make patties out of them. So in the dehydrator, so now they're getting more concentrated. And then I'd eat those patties. I'd put some avocado and tomato on top and wrap them up in lettuce and eat a bunch of those. So it was a lot of raw sprouted chickpeas going into my body. And sometimes I'd be doubled over with gas pains for like a half an hour because it was just too much. When I learned more about these enzyme and digestive enzyme inhibitors in there later on, I thought, that makes sense. That's what I experienced. So there are some types of things you do not want to eat sprouted and raw in the bean family. Chickpeas in moderate quantities are okay. Lentils are really good. They don't contain appreciable amounts of those digestive enzyme inhibitors, and most people can digest those and enjoy eating them really well.
Yeah, those are so wonderful. Cooked, sprouted lentils are amazing in so many ways,
Yeah, exactly.
Well, but from the standpoint that you're coming from, when you have a food that really you feel requires that level of cooking, do you just philosophically feel that that's not really something that's part of the human diet? I mean, do you really see that as something that maybe we should be avoiding because you can't eat it in a state that's in a more natural state? Or do you see that there is a place for a small amount of those foods in a cooked form to get some of the nutrients we know that they do in fact contain? So
I subscribe more to the latter option that you gave.
Yeah.
I don't get too, it is nice to look back at what our ancestors ate, and they didn't eat processed foods. They didn't eat domesticated animal foods, fed genetically modified corn and soy. So they're really high in omega-6s and really high in fat. It's good to look back at what our ancestors did. I think that can be a good guidepost for us, but I've never been inclined to let that fully dictate what we eat today. So I look at it more of, is this a useful food? Is it healthful? Do people enjoy eating it?
Right.
Is it nutrient dense? Is it free of harmful substances? Does it support a health promoting lifestyle for that person in the modern world?
Right.
And if it fits those things, whether it's cooked or raw, I'm okay with it.
Well, let's jump into your, Mastering Raw Food Nutrition Educator program, because I think people would be very interested to know, the structure of that, how you present things, what are you presenting, and what does it offer someone who participates in that?
Sure, sure. So the reason I had brought that up before, and thank you very much, was to say that even though it's called Mastering Raw Food Nutrition, most of our students don't want to eat only raw food. They're kind of like our perspective, and that's why they're attracted to us, that they've got whole food, plant-based as a foundation, and then they see the value in eating a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables. So that's kind of the way we frame it. And in some cases, adding a lot more fruits and vegetables and doing away with some starches can really make a big difference for some people. So my wife, for example, Dr. Dina, was seriously fatigued as a college student in her late teens, and she got checked, for thyroid and anemia and chronic fatigue, Epstein-Barr. All those things were ruled out. When she went plant-based, the term hadn't been developed yet. This was the late 80s, but she was exposed to the book Diet for New America, started eating more plant foods, started to feel enough better that it inspired her to want to learn more. Then when she switched to a raw food diet, the increase in her energy level from conventional to plant-based, went up a certain amount, but then it went up about 5 times more switching to a raw food diet. And there's a lot of people that have noticed similar kind of differences, and so they want to keep it up. And then they take our course to answer questions, cut through the confusion, and learn why that is healthy, and learn how to do it properly, not fall into the pitfalls of not eating enough vegetables or going too high in fat or all the other things that tend to come up.
And so talk to me about the structure of the program. So people that sign up, do you demonstrate things like cooking or food prep classes? And do you go into all of those kinds of things practically for people?
Yeah, so we don't actually have food prep and recipes because there's a lot of programs that do that, and we just specialize in really, it's a deep dive into the scientific aspect of things. Although we make it make sense for everybody. Most of our people don't have a science background, but people with PhDs and who are nurses or doctors and that type of thing also join us because they like that science. So anyway, we look at many different meal plans, conventional eating, it's paleo, keto, few different starch-based plant diets, a few different versions of raw food diets, and we analyze those for nutritional completeness and how much saturated fat and fiber and all those things are in there. And it comes out really clear that heavily in the fruits and vegetables, especially vegetables, are the most nutrient-dense foods, and they leave out various problematic substances that interfere with health. And with that understanding, people are naturally motivated to make changes in their diet because it makes sense to them. They have confidence in what they're doing. And then when they approach recipes, some recipes they may not eat, other recipes they know look good to them, or other ones they may substitute. So in any case, we don't actually, there's not actually recipes in there, but there's meal plans and all the reasons behind how this all works, and so people can structure things and find their individual path. We're not really dogmatic about there's only one way to do it. We encourage people to try different approaches and see what works best for them.
As a testimony to you, I went into the website and I looked at some of the testimonies of people and some of the stories, and they were great. So I could see that the diversity or how you're reaching out to people was definitely really affecting people's lives, in the sense that you had this vision that was, able to really reach people in different stages of where they are. And for practitioners and people that are taking care of people and educating people, that's such an important thing. How much in your own practice, now I know you have this online thing, how much of your work, you and your wife, is involved with actual office practice Is there any of that you still do?
Yes. So I've been on hold actually for a couple of years now. We've got an almost 2-year-old at home. Happened later
Oh,
in life for us. We're absolutely delighted. But
wow, that's exciting. I didn't know that. That's exciting.
oh, really? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. It's fun. Maybe after we hang up, I can have you meet him here. Um, but yeah, it's been a little extra busy. So I haven't seen individual patients one-on-one for a couple of years now. I'm looking forward to starting that again. Hopefully this fall, our schedule will free up enough to do that. But in working with people one-on-one, I spend sometimes analyzing lab work and then having people make some dietary changes and then following up and then considering what they enjoy eating, what their social and family situation is, and based on that, just trying to guide people to fit what works best for them. Again, there's certain principles. We try to get them eating a lot of fruits and vegetables and whole natural plant foods and getting rid of the processed foods and the animal foods. But within that, there's a good amount of flexibility as to how to do it ideally. And one of the reasons that we, both of us, but when I do my individual consulting, take that approach is because sometimes you see somebody went on, say, a low-fat, raw vegan diet, and they feel great, and it's appropriate for them, and they're doing well, and then they tell their friend about it, and their friend's particular biochemistry and whatnot may be such that some starches work better for them, or maybe eating a little bit more fat works better for them. And so for the friend, if that one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work for that friend, they might eventually give it up. And then you hear about people, oh, I went paleo, I went carnivore, I
Right.
did something else. They went to some other extreme. And I always think, what a shame, because they could have just made a few tweaks within the whole food plant-based realm that serve their individual needs more effectively, which would allow them to stay there and get all the benefits, hopefully for the rest of their life, versus something didn't work and therefore they were seeking something else out and then they bail out and then they don't get those benefits anymore.
Well, let me ask you a question then. When you're dealing with an online course like you do, because you're dealing with a general audience of people that you're interacting with, I'm assuming some of the questions make it personal when people funnel things to you, but how do you deal with that dilemma where you know that you need little different tweaks for different people while you're teaching a more general online program? How do you deal with that dilemma?
Yeah, okay. So with that, so we teach, for example, the history of natural hygiene. We teach the history of the Hippocrates and Wigmore approach. We compare and contrast. We teach McDougall's program. We teach people how Doctors Ornish and Esselstyn showed that you can reverse cardiovascular disease with a low-fat, more starch-centered approach. We teach people about all these different options and what the benefits are, and then again, encourage them to experiment with themselves. Yeah, it's tough in a group setting, as well as when we have webinars and where they're live at the end to answer questions. People are like, okay, here's some of my lab things. What should I do?
Oh, everybody wants the personal thing. I know all the time.
And I'm sure you deal with that and you say, look, we deal with that with an individual consult where we can responsibly take a good history, look at more of your past lab work, put it all together. Then, but in the group setting, it's much more difficult to do. So we keep things in terms of general education, and then we encourage people to experiment a little bit on their own and see what works best. And then up until a couple of years ago, and hopefully again in the future, if they want to have a few individual sessions where we can look at things in more depth and detail, then they can use that to augment what they learned in class.
Well, I think what sets you apart is that, as you know, there's so many online programs, and really, unfortunately, sometimes done by people with very little knowledge or evidence-based. I like the fact that you're coming from an evidence base and really sharing the information and the data that highlights the diversity of these plant exclusive programs, so people can then make a decent judgment about what they want to bring into their lives, and know that you're coming from a place where there's data that does support the kinds of things you're teaching. And I think that's incredibly valuable. And not a lot of people do that. And I think there's a real need for that online. So I think you're filling that gap very, very well. And I think it's a great service.
Yeah,
You had a history of training at True North, which of course is one of the great fasting centers that has carried the tradition of natural hygiene and the National Health Association. Do you, in your counseling, still advocate fasting for people under certain conditions, or how? I know you're not doing it because you can't really do it online. So I don't know how much you do that in your life anymore, or how much you recommend that for people. So talk to that just a little bit, the power of fasting, or how you see it.
Yeah, I mean, those 4 years I spent at True North were absolutely incredible, seeing over and over again, routinely, consistently, and predictably, people recover from type 2 diabetes, autoimmune diseases, bringing down their cholesterol, bringing down their blood pressure. I happened to be at True North at the time. Dr. Goldhammer and his team were publishing the first study on high blood pressure, and the 39/13 on average reduction in blood pressure that they would tend to keep up over time if they were compliant with the diet. It would never get old seeing those things over and over and over again. People hobbling in with rheumatoid arthritis, with sedimentation rates really high, taking a bunch of prednisone. A few weeks later, they're off of their medication. Their sed rates down at 20. They don't need their cane anymore. I mean, it absolutely extraordinary to see what the body is capable of when we basically follow the principles of hygiene and get out of the way and let the body heal itself. It's absolutely remarkable.
It's funny at the conference, that we just had the NHA conference, and, have all these docs. And I made a joke that I said, it's so interesting that all of these docs, if you calculated what they spent on their education in these very sophisticated programs, the hundreds of thousands of dollars have led them back to the fundamentals of hygiene. Which, we don't need an educational principle for. It's the foundation of all living things, the biological requirements. So I love the fact that and this is another thing, we have this heyday of lifestyle medicine. And I tell people, long before lifestyle medicine, there were the principles of natural hygiene. That's all it really is. Yeah. And we just need to circle back and understand this remarkable power of healing that the body has, and especially when we give it the basic biological requirements that it needs, that health just follows like water flows downhill. So I love the fact that, through all of these databases and through all this evidence base, what sticks out are still these fundamental, powerful principles of natural hygiene, and people like you carrying the torch and really still providing the evidence base for the power of that. I think it's fantastic.
Well, coming from you, especially Dr. Sabatino, I'm really honored by your comments and appreciate that. And as far as things being legitimately and scientifically based, I mean, I had some really good training when I was really young getting into this. I mean, the NHA, then called the American Natural Hygiene Society, right, was probably my biggest influence. And I would go to these seminars, and I would hear from people like you and Doctors Goldhammer and Furman, who were still on the path, and many others, some of who aren't around anymore, but Keiki Sidwa and the doctors Alec and Nejla Burton and others. And you guys presented things in a way that was, the common sense was always there. You get rid of the junk, you let the body heal itself. Diseases reverse often, or people at least make significant improvements. And you had the science there to back things up as well. So that was really my model. And it made a lot of sense to me. And it really shaped how I continued on with things since then, going back to school, earning a doctorate degree in chiropractic, and seeing so many things that I knew more generally get more concrete and make sense as I learned biochemistry and histology and endocrinology and all those things, that the pieces of the puzzle started to add together. And then 4 years at True North after that, really saw how things worked. And that just, I mean, how can you argue with results like that? You just don't see these kind of benefits anywhere else. Right. And so that really, really had a very positive influence on me, and have just basically continued on that trajectory. So I thank you and other mentors mentioned, and for setting that foundation.
Well, we're all in that lineage of mentoring, because all of those characters that some of them are not around now were the ones that were my main mentors, so that whole progression of these people whose shoulders we get to stand on as our starting point has profoundly affected the way we help and teach people today, which it's priceless. It's one of the really great benefits and one of the things I'm most incredibly grateful for myself, just like you.
Yeah.
So Rick, as we wind this down a little bit, is there any final words you'd like to share with the audience out here? Anything you'd like to tell them?
Sure. Well, you had asked also about fasting. So we've got a whole week in our course, week 22, dedicated to fasting. We compare and contrast juice fasting and water fasting. And I talk about some of my experiences at True North, some of the things that I saw, some of the times when we did actually require a bit of intervention, had to bring someone down to the emergency room or whatnot, to distinguish a cleansing reaction from something that actually required intervention. That's where those hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of education sometimes come in handy, to know the distinction between, oh, you're just cleansing, better out than in, keep it up, versus this isn't normal. You're not just going to cleanse your way through this. We need to intervene and do the right thing to make sure you're going to have a good outcome versus a bad outcome. And that can make the difference between sometimes even life and death. We've all heard the stories of people having some bad outcomes fasting with someone who wasn't able to make those distinctions because just reading a few Shelton books didn't give them the educational background about the human body to make those distinctions.
Well, the thing we learn in those apprenticeships is how important monitoring actually is, because you really don't know that. Like, you first fasted, you did what I did when I first fasted. You read a book and you said, you know what, people did this, I'm going to stop eating and see where it takes me, And this freaks me out because, there's a lot of these fasting groups online now, and I'll read something where it'll be someone will say, well, I'm in the 30th day of a fast and I'm having this symptom. Anybody have any ideas?
Oh my God,
and I'm like,
right?
No, you can't do that. I'm sitting here saying, you just can't do that.
Leading the blind.
Yeah, it's not a good thing. So the point you made is such a very important point. Stopping eating for a few days, anybody probably could do that as a rule. But if you're going to really use fasting as a tool for health and recovery and do it longer, you should be under the supervision of someone who knows and who's been there and who's monitored fast clinically over a long period of time. So that's very valuable input.
Yeah, and just to add to what you're saying, I during the time I was at True North, there was about 600 to 800 fasting patients during those 4 years. I have 6 or 8 case histories, so it's about 1% of the time where intervention was really required.
Right.
So in other words, people go out there and can do it. Maybe it's not perfect. Maybe they don't rest enough. Maybe their neighbors are coming over freaking out because they're getting too skinny or whatever. But they make it through. They have a great experience like I did. I mean, it was in the winter in Connecticut when it was cold. I was working at a ski resort as a waitering during the weekend. I went up and did that, during a 14-day water fast. Not the best experience, but I still had positive outcomes. So a lot of people do, despite the non-perfect conditions, do have the positive outcomes. But if you get enough of those, it might be 1, 2, 5, 10%. You're going to have people who run into trouble and have bad outcomes. And then fasting gets a bad name when those experiences become well known. And it just never has to happen with proper supervision. So we're on the same page there for sure.
Well, I just want to thank my guest, Dr. Rick Dina, today. Rick, thank you for sharing your heart, your information, your knowledge, your experience. And I urge people to follow Dr. Dina. His website, his information will be in the show notes, and we share those through the course of this program. And I really want to thank the audience out there, because without you, we can't do what we do. And I want to really thank you on behalf of the National Health Association for being part of this active, healthy community. And again, on behalf of the National Health Association, I thank you for joining our podcast, the Health Science Podcast today. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and I look forward to being with you on the next episode of the Health Science Podcast. Thank you so much. You've been listening to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association. Thank you for joining us today and for your commitment to evidence-based health science that backs a whole food, plant-exclusive lifestyle and contributes to the well-being of all people, animals, and our environment. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino. Be sure to leave a rating and a review, and we'll see you on the next show.